The last thing I remember before my world fell apart was the rhythmic, failing beep of my father-in-law's heart monitor. I was holding Arthur's hand, feeling the last of his strength fade, when I heard my husband's voice from the hallway. Mark wasn't calling family. He was on the phone with an investor. "My father is about to pass," he said, his voice filled with a practiced urgency, and it's made me realize how short life is, which is why this project has to succeed. In that moment, as one man's life was ending, my husband was using it as the opening line for his next failed venture. That was the moment I should have known he was a stranger. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Hazel, and for as long as I can remember, I've understood the world through the dirt under my fingernails. There's a fundamental truth in cultivating a garden, in taking a chaotic patch of land and giving it structure, beauty, and life. My landscape design business wasn't just a job. It was an extension of who I was, built on the simple principle that real value comes from what you can grow with your own two hands. It was this business that quietly paid the mortgage on our Boston suburban home and kept our fridge stocked, a silent foundation beneath the soaring, hollow architecture of my husband Mark's dreams. For 7 years, I had been the primary investor in Mark's ventures, though my contributions were never listed on any term sheet. They were paid in late nights I spent alone while he was networking. In weekends, I worked to cover our bills after one of his startups inevitably collapsed, and in the unwavering belief I poured into him when no one else would. He was a master of the pitch, a charismatic visionary who could talk for hours about disrupting industries and building the next unicorn. Yet he had never built anything tangible in his life. Our dynamic was a quiet, unspoken agreement he would dream, and I would make sure the ground beneath his feet was solid enough for him to do so. The only other person who seemed to understand this was his father, Arthur. He was a man from another era, a real estate magnate who had built his empire with brick, steel, and handshake deals. He saw the world in foundations and frameworks, and he saw the lack of either in his own son. Arthur and I connected over our shared belief in tangible results. He would visit my work sites, his expensive shoes covered in mud, and watch with quiet approval as my team transformed overgrown lots into serene gardens. "You build real things, Hazel," he told me once, his voice raspy with age and illness. "Things that grow. Never forget that." That conversation happened just a few weeks before the end. The last thing I remember before my world fell apart was the rhythmic, failing beep of Arthur's heart monitor in the sterile quiet of the ICU. I was holding his hand, feeling the last of his formidable strength fade, when I heard my husband's voice from the hallway. Mark wasn't calling family to update them. He was on the phone with an investor, his voice filled with a practiced, theatrical urgency. "My father is about to pass," he said, "and it's made me realize how short life is, which is why this project has to succeed." In that moment, as one man's life was ending, my husband was using it as the opening line for his next failed venture. That was the moment I should have known I was married to a stranger. The reading of the will took place in a downtown law office that smelled of old leather and money. The air was thick with a corporate, impersonal grief. I sat beside Mark, expecting we would receive a comfortable inheritance, perhaps enough to finally give him the seed money he always claimed was the only thing holding him back. The lawyer, a man with a face as dry as his documents, droned on about bequests to charities and longtime employees, the bulk of Arthur's visible fortune. Then, he cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He explained that a small, almost forgotten investment Arthur had made decades ago in a friend's tech startup had recently been acquired by a major corporation. The shares, held in a private family trust, had exploded in value. He paused for dramatic effect before announcing the final valuation of Mark's portion, $62 million. The number seemed to suck all the air out of the room. A wave of vertigo washed over me, and I instinctively reached for Mark's hand, expecting to share a look of disbelief, of a future suddenly, impossibly rewritten. But he didn't turn to me. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, when he finally did glance in my direction. His eyes were not filled with joy or relief. They were cold, sharp, and appraising, like an accountant assessing a line item on a balance sheet. In that split second, I saw with a gut-wrenching certainty that he wasn't seeing a wife to share this fortune with. He was looking at a liability he now had the capital to liquidate. The $62 million didn't just change our financial status, it acted as a catalyst, burning away the charming facade of the man I married and revealing the cruel stranger beneath. The transformation was terrifyingly swift. Within the first week, a blood-red McLaren appeared in our driveway. Its aggressive design a stark contrast to my mud-splattered work truck. Our quiet home, once a sanctuary filled with the scent of soil and blooming flowers, became the epicenter of a nonstop party for a cast of sycophants Mark now called his friends. By the second week, I found myself locked out of our joint accounts. When I confronted him, he simply smirked, a condescending curl to his lip I'd never seen before. "You wouldn't understand the complexities of wealth management, Hazel," he said, as if explaining a complex theory to a child. The man who had once relied on my income to survive was now treating me as if I were financially illiterate. His world was now one of private bankers and exclusive portfolios, a world to which I was not invited. The third week brought discoveries of a more personal betrayal. Credit card statements, mistakenly sent to our old address, showed receipts for $1,000 dinners, expensive jewelry I had never received, and weekend stays at boutique hotels in our own city. He began to openly mock my life's work, the very thing that had supported him for years. He'd watch me come home, tired and fulfilled after a long day on site, and sneer, "Still playing in the mud, I see." The final, devastating blow came not in a moment of heated argument, but in a calculated act of cruelty. He cornered me in the garden, the one I had poured my heart into, the one Arthur had loved so much. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of a Japanese maple I had planted myself. "I've leveled up, Hazel," he said, his voice dripping with a contempt that felt like a physical poison. "My father only saw you as a charity project to keep me grounded. Well, I'm flying now and you're just dead weight." He didn't even have the courage to hand me the divorce papers himself. The next day, while I was in the middle of a crucial meeting with a new client at a worksite, a sharply dressed courier interrupted us. In front of my entire team and my client, he handed me a thick legal envelope. The public humiliation was clearly part of the strategy. He wasn't just ending our marriage. He was trying to dismantle my life, my reputation, and my very sense of self. The divorce was a blitzkrieg, his legal team, a pack of sharks from a top-tier firm, steamrolled my small-town lawyer. They buried us in paperwork, motions, and threats of a protracted court battle that they knew I couldn't afford. I was forced to sign a humiliating settlement that gave me barely enough to cover 6 months' rent, just to make the bleeding stop. I signed the final documents from my friend Jessica's couch, feeling like a ghost, hollowed out and invisible. It was over. Less than an hour after my digital signature officially dissolved my marriage, a sleek black car pulled up outside Jessica's apartment building. A man in a perfectly tailored suit stepped out and, after a brief conversation with the doorman, was standing at our door. He carried a single, thick envelope made of heavy cream-colored paper, sealed with a wax stamp bearing the Vance family crest. My hands trembled as I took it, assuming it was some final legal threat from Mark. Inside wasn't a letter from a lawyer. It was a bound copy of the operating agreement for the Vance Family Trust. My eyes scanned the dense, intimidating legalese, my heart pounding with a confusing mix of fear and curiosity. Then I saw it, a single paragraph, highlighted in pale yellow. The language was precise, ironclad, and it was Arthur's voice, speaking to me from beyond the grave. The $62 million was, indeed, designated for Mark, But he was only the beneficiary. Arthur, in his infinite old world wisdom, had named me, Hazel, as the sole trustee, granting me full and absolute control over the management and distribution of the funds. And then came the clause that changed everything. It was brutally simple should Mark initiate divorce proceedings for any reason other than documented infidelity on my part. Full and irrevocable control of the trust and all its assets would transfer entirely to the trustee within 24 hours of the marriage's legal dissolution. As the final words settled in my mind, my phone, which had been painfully silent for weeks, began to scream. It vibrated violently on the coffee table, the screen flashing with a single name mark, a missed call, a frantic voicemail, another call. It was a desperate, incessant siren, the sound of a man who had just realized he hadn't just divorced his wife, he had gifted her his entire fortune. The next morning, he was there, on Jessica's doorstep. He looked pathetic. The designer suit he wore was wrinkled. His hair was a mess, and his face was pale and tear-streaked. The confident, cruel man who had discarded me was gone, replaced by a panicked child on the verge of a tantrum. He fell to his knees right there in the hallway, grabbing for my hand. He begged me to remarry him, promising me anything, babbling about a terrible mistake and how grief had clouded his judgment. I looked down at the man who had called me dead weight, the man who had tried to humiliate me into oblivion, and I felt nothing. The burning anger, the profound sadness, it had all been replaced by a calm, quiet emptiness. I let him finish his desperate, unconvincing performance, the calculated contrition plain on his face. When he finally ran out of words, I looked at him, really looked at him, and spoke with a clarity that surprised even myself. The thing about building with your hands, Mark, I said softly, is that you learn to tell the difference between a solid foundation and a hollow facade. You should go. I gently closed the door on his sputtering protests and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. I walked back into the living room, picking up the trust documents that now made me one of the most powerful women in the state. I knew what my first call would be. It wasn't to a financial advisor or a lawyer. It was to an architect. I wasn't going to move into a penthouse. I was going to build a home, my home, from the ground up. My first official act as the controller of the Vance Family Trust was not to buy a new car or take a lavish vacation. I called the dean of my alma mater that afternoon. The legal framework was put in place to establish the Arthur Vance Landscape Design Scholarship, a full-ride endowment for talented students from low-income backgrounds. It was a way to honor the man who had seen my true worth. Arthur's final gift wasn't the money. It was the freedom to continue building real things, things that would grow and last, on a scale I had never imagined. The fortune Mark saw as an endpoint had become my beginning. Closing the door on Mark was the end of one battle, but the beginning of a war I hadn't anticipated. His desperation quickly curdled into rage. Within days, I was served with a lawsuit. He wasn't just contesting the trust. He was suing me for fraud, claiming I had manipulated his ailing father, exerting undue influence to trick him into signing the document. His lawyers painted a picture of me as a cunning gold digger who had preyed on a dying man. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. This new reality forced me to move faster than I was emotionally ready for. I couldn't rely on a small-town lawyer anymore. I used a small, initial distribution from the trust, something the terms clearly allowed for its own legal defense, to hire a team from one of Boston's most respected estate law firms. My lead counsel was a woman named Eleanor Vance, no relation to Arthur, a coincidence that felt like a sign. A sharp, no-nonsense lawyer in her 60s who looked at my case files with a grim, knowing expression. Men like your ex-husband believe the world is their personal ATM, she said during our first meeting. They are always shocked when the machine asks for a PIN they don't possess. The legal proceedings were a brutal education. Mark's team tried to drown us in discovery requests, demanding years of my personal financial records, emails, even text messages with my friends, all in an attempt to find a single shred of evidence that I was anything other than the supportive wife I had been. At the same time, I had to work with Eleanor's financial team to conduct a forensic audit of the millions Mark had already spent. It was a sickening journey through his betrayal, a down payment on a Malibu beach house with his mistress, a failed investment in a friend's cryptocurrency scheme, and $500,000 on cars and watches. While the lawyers fought, Mark's mother, Catherine, began her own campaign. She called me daily, her voice shifting from tearful pleas about family loyalty to thinly veiled threats. Arthur would be spinning in his grave if he knew you were doing this to his only son, she insisted. I calmly replied, I believe Arthur knew exactly what he was doing, which is why we're in this situation. Her final attempt was an ambush. She arranged a chance encounter at a restaurant, showing up with a somber-looking Mark in tow. I simply stood up, left cash on the table for my uneaten lunch, and walked out without a word. Through Eleanor, I sent a clear message that all future communication would be through legal channels only. The lawsuit dragged on for months, but it had an unintended side effect. The story was leaked to the Boston press. At first, I was mortified, but the narrative that emerged was not the one Mark had intended. Reporters dug into my background, my self-made business, my reputation for integrity. They contrasted it with Mark's history of failed startups and his recent ostentatious spending. The scholarship I had established became the centerpiece of the story. I wasn't the villain, I was the wronged wife. And Arthur was the brilliant patriarch who had delivered justice from the grave. This newfound publicity brought my business to a whole new level. Clients who had previously been out of my reach were now calling, wanting the woman with the Midas touch for gardens and justice to design their estates. I hired more staff, moved my company into a larger office space, and found myself energized by the work. It was my sanctuary, a place where my skills were the only currency that mattered. As my professional life flourished, I began to build a personal one. The architect I hired helped me find a beautiful plot of land overlooking a nature preserve. We designed a house that was the antithesis of the cold glass and chrome penthouse Mark had craved. It was built with natural materials, wood, stone, and a great deal of glass to bring the outside in. The centerpiece wasn't a home theater or a wine cellar, but a massive greenhouse attached to the kitchen. A place where I could experiment and grow things year-round. Building that house, beam by beam, was the most therapeutic act of my life. Mark's life, in parallel, was imploding. His lawsuit was dismissed in a scathing judgment. The judge found clear evidence that Mark and his initial lawyer had known about the trustee clause and had deliberately rushed the divorce to prevent me from discovering it. His lawyer was referred to the state bar for ethics violations. Stripped of his funding, Mark's lavish lifestyle evaporated. The mistress left, the sycophantic friends vanished, and the creditors closed in. He was forced to sell the McLaren at a huge loss and move into a small rented apartment. About a year after the divorce, I was at a downtown restaurant for a business lunch when I saw him. He was sitting alone at the bar, staring into a half-empty glass. The designer suit was gone, replaced by a wrinkled shirt. He looked older, heavier, and profoundly tired. He saw me before I could leave, and with a moment's hesitation, he walked over to my table. "Hazel," he said, his voice quiet, "you look well." Up close, the change was even more striking. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shame. "Can I sit for a moment?" he asked, against my better judgment. I nodded. "I filed for bankruptcy last month," he said, not looking at me. "The investments all failed. They foreclosed on the Malibu house. It's all gone." He finally lifted his eyes to meet mine. "I owe you an apology. A real one. Not like before. I was cruel, and I betrayed you after everything you did for me. There's no excuse. For the first time." His words felt genuine. "My father was right about you," he admitted, a bitter smile touching his lips. "And he was right about me." We sat in silence for a moment. The anger I once felt had long since faded, replaced by a kind of distant, sad indifference. "I hope you find your way forward, Mark," I said, and I meant it. "But our paths need to stay separate." He nodded, accepting it without argument. As he stood to leave, I discreetly signaled the bartender and paid for his drink. It wasn't pity. It was a final, quiet act of closure, like turning over the last spadeful of earth on a finished garden. Walking home that evening, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed. The betrayal that I thought would destroy me had instead become the fire that forged me into someone stronger, someone more authentic. The money was a tool, but the true gift Arthur had given me was the chance to be completely, unapologetically myself. I had found that true wealth isn't about what you have, but about what you can build, what you can grow, and the peace you find when you are finally planted in your own soil.